So, once again, welcome friends. In the last couple of classes, we discussed Homi Ke Bhabha and his key concepts like hybridity, ambivalence, mimicry, and third space. Now, we are moving on to two very powerful post colonial critics, Edward Said and Aijaz Ahmad. Edward Said, whose full name was Edward Wadi Said, was born on 1st November 1935 and left this world on 24th September 2003. He was a Palestinian American academic, literary critic, and political activist, Palestinian professor of literature at Columbia University, who was greatly influenced by Michel Foucault. Most important of his works comprise Joseph Conrad and the Fiction of Autobiography, Orientalism, The World, the Text and the Critic, Culture and Imperialism, and Humanism and Democratic Criticism on Late Style. So, in The World, the Text and the Critic, which is a collection of essays that expand his ideas on Orientalism, um, in this work, he challenges the notion of literature as an isolated, purely aesthetic object and argues that texts are deeply embedded in the historical, political, and social realities of the world. He sets his views on what is wrong with criticism, and he believes that the critic's preoccupation with the text as object is a kind of evasion of responsibility, uh, because it neglects the actualities of human life, politics, societies, and events. Power and resistance to it spawn texts and lead readers to them, but critics have sealed themselves off the hermeneutical seal from social reality and the substance of literature, and as a result, their vision is not complete. So, according to Said, texts are definitely reproducible but subject to certain legal, political, economic, and social constraints, and in their sustained production and distribution. They are also the result of some immediate contact between author and medium, which once duplicated is in the world and beyond authorial control. So, Western encounters with non Western cultures as opportunities for the political use of cultural ignorance. He says how the Western cultures tended to exploit the non Western world, whether by design, accident, or historical necessity. The contextless reading of alien texts served imperialist ambitions. And it comes as a surprise to many of us when Macaulay gives that infamous speech in the British Parliament in favor of the superiority of English culture and literature, and challenges, rather, nullifies all the wisdom of the East, saying that one particular section of a library in Europe is worth the whole of literatures produced in the Orient, or let's say the third world. So that itself can be taken as an example of how the proper contextual meaning has been missing from the interpretation, and Macaulay is not aware of the strengths of the Oriental literature and still dares to compare it with his own literature. So we find that at the critics level, Said makes a difference between secular criticism, independent criticism, and worldly criticism. So secular criticism, he says, is independent, worldly, and self-critical, while Affiliated criticism has its loyalty to the state and to some kind of religious institutions and academic affiliations or establishments. So it, looks at the world not in black and white but in terms of its colored vision or its own parameters. So he says that true criticism, apart from these secular or affiliated criticisms, is something which must remain independent and engaged with real world struggles, and should not merely interpret texts but actively challenge dominant narratives. So he promotes a critical consciousness that questions Eurocentric perspectives and opens up space for marginalized voices. In his Culture and Imperialism, which is an expansion of his ideas presented in Orientalism, he uh, the book the title itself comes from two very powerful works, Culture and Anarchy by Matthew Arnold and Culture and Society by Raymond Williams. He argues on how canonical Western literature reflects and reinforces imperial ideologies containing implicit assumptions of Western superiority and portraying the colonized world as a backdrop for European ambitions. For instance, the fiction like Jane Austen's Mansfield Park presents colonial wealth as natural and unquestioned. So, obviously, they provide a certain kind of stereotypical image of the colonies. In Joseph Conrad's, and a lot of people believe that Joseph Conrad was an enlightened writer who, critiqued imperialism, but still, unconsciously though, he portrays Africa as a primitive and chaotic space, and so is found guilty of stereotyping or undermining the African people and African culture. Likewise, Rudyard Kipling's Skim romanticizes British rule in India, and that way it reinforces colonial power structures. And I'm talking about, at least these two figures, Joseph Conrad and Rudyard Kipling, who are considered sort of, soft on the colonies. So, on the contrary, Said also highlights the anti colonial voices that resisted these narratives. For instance, Chinua Achbe's Things Fall Apart, it reclaims African history and critiques colonial destruction. Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, uh, it talks about India's transition from British rule to independence. Amy Caesar's discourse on colonialism, it condemns European imperial brutality. So, Said believes that literature serves as a tool for decolonization and resistance. So, literature has the power to narrate or to block other narratives from forming and emerging, which might contradict the colonization of a people. Said articulates an approach within literary and cultural studies that would actualize those hybrid counter energies which provide a community or culture made up of numerous anti systemic hints and practices for collective human existence that is not based on coercion or domination. So, he vouches for a culture or an existence which is free from the dichotomies of the ruler ruled or the binaries of superiority and inferiority. And so, he calls for such, approaches within literary and cultural studies, uh, Boss, comments that uh, the aim of Edward Said, and I quote, is not to separate but to connect, because cultural forms are hybrid, mixed, impure, and the time has come in cultural analysis to reconnect their analysis with their actuality. So, thus we find that Said challenges the rigid separation between the West and the rest, and he talks about the overlapping histories, where he claims that the histories of Europe and the colonized world are deeply intertwined, and modern globalization continues to blur the boundaries of identity and culture further. He also argues that even after decolonization, imperialism still exists in global politics in the form of media representations and cultural narratives which dominate the global south and always portray non Western countries as unstable, dangerous, or backward, and indulge in what may be termed as imperial propaganda of othering, or othering, and proving that non Western countries are still inferior compared to these Western powers. Therefore, the book is a heartfelt rumination on global patterns of domination, addressing the connections between Western imperialist practice and cultural production, as well as the characteristics of various resistance cultures within the so called peripheries. Um, Before I talk about Aijaz Ahmad, I would like to further talk about Orientalism, which to me appears to be one of the most prominent, texts by Edward Said. Orientalism talks about how the Western powers have created Orient as something other or inferior or exotic in relation to Western. So, Western study depiction and representation of the East, especially the Middle East and Asia, is not neutral or objective, and so Edward Said finds it discursive, the construction, as a system of knowledge that helped justify and maintain Western imperial domination. As I said, the Orient is made into an exotic, backward, irrational, and inferior other, in contrast to the rational, civilized West. And so, Oriental discourse is not just about ideas. So, Edward Said says that, um, our literature, or the literature of the Orient, uh, becomes a tool of power, and institutions like academia, literature, and even travel writing produced knowledge that reinforced colonial rule by these Western powers, in which, you know, like even our earlier writers have also fallen into this trap and have propagated this image of the Orient, or let's say our own country, India, as a country of snake charmers and easy believers, not the progressive, rational India, but the exotic India, which is nowhere closer to the civilizational parameters of the West. And again, the binary opposites like the West Orient divide is greatly informed by a sense of superiority and othering or inferiority, which is relational. So, Occident or the Western world is considered superior to the Orient or the Eastern world, while rationality is attached to Western. The Eastern is considered mostly irrational. Again, civilized, barbaric, masculine, feminine, active, passive. So, such binaries exist in this world, and these binaries have been created to elevate the West and to dehumanize the East. So, cultural imperialism is one form of domination of the West that continues to be there despite we have been freed from the fetters of the colonial rule. So, even after decolonization, we still realize Western cultural dominance, which is persisting through media, literature, and education, and in some form or the other continues to dominate us. And Said is very critical of this ongoing intellectual and cultural control by these Western powers of the Eastern, powers, or Eastern Orient, and as a result calls for resistance and counter narratives. uh, and he says that there is certainly a need for post colonial voices to challenge and subvert these dominant Western narratives. And there is also what he says is a need for recovery of suppressed histories and perspectives. And of late, friends, we have seen it happening in a post colonial nation like India. It is happening elsewhere as well, as most of the erstwhile colonized nations now, as independent nations, are trying to recover and reassert their cultural identity. So, Edward Said becomes a very, very powerful cultural critic who calls for Eastern Enlightenment to be accepted by the Western world. So, this is again a kind of negotiation between the Eastern and the Western to come up with something that is much more creative, much more balanced. Another key critic is Aijaz Ahmad, but Aijaz Ahmad, as opposed to Edward Said, is critical of Edward Said and many of his propositions, because you know he was a Marxist philosopher, literary theorist, and political commentator born in India, and he was a leading literary critical theorist and literary scholar who are there worldwide. He was one of them. He focused on literature and culture, internationalism, imperialism, and post colonialism. And of his important works, we can talk about In Theory, which is his best known work. In Theory, Classes, Nations, Literatures. The other work is Lineages of the Present, Ideology and Politics in Contemporary South Asia. A third one is On Communalism and Globalization, Offensives of the Far Right. So, in his In Theory, he critiques post colonial studies, especially the works of Edward Said, Frederick Jameson, and Benedict Anderson, considering them to be too idealistic and text centered rather than focusing on the material conditions of imperialism. So, he criticizes them for treating culture as something monolithic, something independent of the economic realities or material conditions of the subject formation or subjects. So, according to him, Orientalism as a discourse exists across time, is too broad, and ignores the role of capitalism in the cultural formation. And there are differences within the third world. So, he also criticizes them particularly for essentializing uh, the third world culture or treating it as a single homogeneous entity, while it is not that. It is something, you know, if we talk about the post colonial nations themselves, each of the nations may have its own typical experiences and problems, and so clubbing the different nations under one head will certainly be injustice. This is what Aijaz Ahmad thinks and criticizes, because as a Marxist, he looks at the historical processes, um, or categories that have been marginalized in uh, literature as well as representations, and again are found missing from most of the post colonial criticism. So he argues that imperialism should be analyzed through Marxist categories such as class struggle, economic exploitation, and historical materialism, because the Bhadralok or the gentry will not have the same effect of colonialism as the cross section of the society. So, the role of the multinational corporations, neocolonialisms, and class divisions within post colonial nations, they also should be studied in order to realize the extent to which the colonizers have been made to suffer. So, according to Aijaz Ahmad, imperialism was not just a cultural project or cultural invasion of the West, by the West of the East, but it was primarily an economic system of exploitation, as national liberation movements were often led by working class and socialist movements, not just intellectuals. Therefore, it needs a critical framework of Marxist theories and revolutionary politics. So, Samantrai, in his review, points out, uh, commenting on In Theory, I quote, "In Theory signals the eagerness with which scholars have awaited an inquiry into the political implications of our conceptual tools and theoretical propositions, and it is a careful Marxist reading of a particular political configuration of authors and positions which has surfaced in particular branches of literary theory, clustered around questions of empire, colony, migrancy, post coloniality, and so on." So, Ahmed critiques Jameson's proclamations of all third world literature, making a closed category to produce a theory on third world literature, because he believes that within the literatures of the third world there is a difference of experience and history. So, if you have to look at it, you have to look at those differences in their historical experiences, um, and they may not be homogeneous, rather, they will be heterogeneous. So, according to him, this idea needs to be deconstructed based on nations' individual decolonization, migration, and post coloniality. So we find that Aijaz Ahmad goes in a different direction, and he calls for a different lens to look at the post colonial literature from the Marxist perspective, applying different lenses, and so he is critical. So if we put these two together, we will find that there are differences in their approaches. While Edward Said is primarily a cultural critic and talks about the cultural representations, discourse, and media. Aijaz Ahmad, on the other hand, looks at the process of colonization and post coloniality um, under the garb of material conditions, class struggle, and imperialism. Uh, for examples, he uh, talks about the revolutionary, nationalist revolutionary activities of these post colonial nations, and calls for a close, analysis of the same, so that uh, it may be understood how, the process of colonization impacted different people differently. And so the critical methods and methodologies that are used by both Edward Said and Aizaz Ahmad, while Edward Said, relies on deconstruction and Foucauldian power discourse, Aizaz Ahmad, on the other hand, takes recourse to Marxist materialism and historical specificity. So, both these concepts are very, very important when it comes to the reading of post colonial literature, because how the post colonial literature is viewed, how it has come into existence, and what professed aims does it have, they all have to be clearly spelled out. So while Edward Said, is critical of the West for its dominance and continued, propagation of the Orient as inferior other, or an unholy place, as most of the Western accounts, point to our world as something which is chaotic and needs discipline and order, and at the same time the people, uh, you know uh, are considered irrational, superstitious, uh, and none of our enlightened talks or enlightened texts are presented to their own world, for fear of being subjected to what we can call a secondary status. If the Western world comes to realize that what Macaulay said in the British Parliament at that point in time did not have any substance, and the Eastern people whom he wanted to, or in particular the Indian people whom he wanted to civilize, were much more civilized compared to his nation way back. Obviously, the Western world, when it awakes to these facts, will turn reflective and will look at its own attitude to these post colonial nations and their cultures. So, critics like Edward Said or Aizaz Ahmad, they are talking about all sorts of discursive uh, practices adopted by the colonies, or by the colonizers, or by the Western canon, um, you know, to continue to show the third world in a poor light. And so there is enough space for contestation, for reassertion of cultural identity. And again, there is a need, according to Aizaz Ahmad, there is a need to look at it also as an attempt by these colonial powers to assert their superiority, and also their professed aim to exploit the colonies and their resources economically. So, friends, these two cultural critics, two post-colonial critics rather, uh, one is a cultural critic, one is a Marxist critic. They provide us very powerful tools and lenses to look at our own literature and look for the threads that have been, you know, interwoven in such a way that they resist the Western canon and establish themselves and call for, uh, fair treatment of our people, our culture, and our nations. So, thank you very much. We'll continue this discussion in the next class as well. For now, thank you very much.